Welcome to Wise Squirrels, the podcast for late diagnosed adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Dave Delaney. Actually, let's talk about your diagnosis. When were you, how old were you, or when were you diagnosed with ADHD?
So it was, did the lighting just change here?
No, you're good.
Okay. Maybe I just woke up.
We'll get it in post.
Yeah. So my son was in grade 5, 6 elementary school, and then was going into a special program for grade 7 for kids who were in an enhanced program. They didn't use the term gifted. They said enhanced. The program's enhanced. The kids they're all the same. There's no differences.
Yes. Right.
Right. Anyway, so he, about a month and a bit in, the school called and said, "We need to talk to you. Nick hasn't done any of his homework." And I was like, what? He's the most conscientious, and he gets his homework done. And part of the problem was he was bright, and he would get his homework done in class because at the back of the classroom, there was a computer, a couple of old computers. These were probably donated by a muffler shop when they upgraded their billing system, but it was a computer. And so if you got your work done, you could go play on the computer. So he zoomed through his work, got it done, and his handwriting was a shambles, common trait with ADHD because he's in a rush. And then he was back there. Well, he gets into high school, and there's homework now. There's assignments to take home and work on and projects to do. Yeah. He has no experience doing that. He has no structure. My marriage was just ending at that point, so there wasn't a lot of support. It slipped between the cracks. And when they called, it was just, oh, what? They said, "We'd like to test him to see if he is in fact enhanced, or if this is the right program for him. In other words, if he's smart enough or gifted enough or whatever they were measuring." And they came back and said, "No, he's in the right course, but he's got ADHD." And that left me with, what? No, that's he's not running around. He does smash stuff. He's not trouble. He's because all I knew was what everybody else had heard, which had these myths that had been spread, many of them deliberately by a particular religious organization that was trying to discredit psychiatry. So I didn't know anything. And then I start reading about it, and I look at that list of symptoms. Well, if this is ADHD, I have ADHD.
Yes.
Oh, I have. And then I thought about my dad, my grandfather, because as you probably know, it's highly heritable.
Yes.
It's about as heritable as height. And so apparently my grandfather was on the British music hall stage near the beginning of the 20th century. So yeah, it runs in families. And so he got diagnosis. They gave us some tools. They suggested medication. I was totally against it. But they said it works and it's safe, and there's been millions of doses and nobody has died from it if you use it properly. And I was at this point seeing a specialist for my ADHD, and I don't drink, smoke, anything. I'd never done any of that. I mean, I had the occasional beer, but I didn't want to take drugs. It felt like cheating, and I was afraid I'd lose my creativity. So the doctor, the psychologist I was seeing, great guy, Dr. Fleming, said, I've worked with a lot of creative people. I've never heard anyone say that. So he said, try it, take the pill at 9 or 8. And if you don't like how it makes you feel, then don't take the next one at lunch. And so I took one and then one at lunch, and nothing seemed to change. And then it was only by the 3rd day I finally figured, and I think I was on very low dose. I was actually, for the first day, breaking them in half. I was so worried. I couldn't tell the difference. So I then saw this big pile of envelopes from the government, the Canadian government. And they were the GST and the income tax. And I was a year and a quarter, like 5 quarters behind in paying my goods and services tax.
Oh, no.
And I thought if I could just get one 3-month period done. I sat down, and by 11 something, I was done. I was only a year behind. And by the end of the day, well, what's amazing was I took the second pill, I came back, I continued. At the end of the day, I was only 1/4 behind. I'd done a year's worth in a day after being unable to, and at that point, my fear was, I'm turned into an accountant. And but it turned out I was still funny. Still, we were working on the Red Green show at that point, and so, which was great. And in fact, the first person who suggested I might have ADHD was Red Green, Steve Smith, who used to be a teacher, and teachers spot it right away. And he, in one of the adventures with Bill, I'm doing something and thrashing around. He goes, "Oh, looks like Bill's having one of his ADD moments." And that was the first time, and that was 5 years before I was actually formally diagnosed.
That's interesting. So he spotted it too. Like,
yeah.
And I mean, you did that show for what, 15 years, right? Like,
yeah,
I think it was 91 is when you started.
Yeah. And it was, so it ran for 15 seasons. Now I was only there for, I think, 11 of them, a whole bunch for 8. And then I did a pilot for History Television called History Bites. And it turned into a series. And so I couldn't handle both because I was producing, directing, writing, well, with other writers, this other show, History Bites. So I had to step away. I left Steve in the lurch because it was very short notice. I felt so sorry about it, but that ran and it was a big hit. Somebody, one of the big papers called it the cleverest Canadian comedy ever, something like that. And I thought, okay, yeah, that's what it is. There may be ones that get slightly more laughs, but this is damn clever. And anyway, so I was away for that. And then after that ran its course and we stopped doing full seasons and just doing specials. Then I was able to come back to Red Green. And it was through Red Green, actually, that I met my future wife, Ava. She was the editor on the show.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And then together she became the editor on History Bites and then co-producer of the specials we did and of all the documentaries done. She was just in this morning editing the next bunch of videos. So it was an interesting experience. And then in the middle of that, when I got the diagnosis, I told Patrick McKenna, who plays Harold, I told him about it. And I kind of suspected he might have it. And he said, oh yeah, he knew, because there were family members who were clearly ADHD, and I think his son had been diagnosed and so on. So they knew, but he'd never been formally diagnosed. And that's when I proposed doing a documentary, and he said, sure. And you know why he said sure? Because he has ADHD. he didn't think of that. And in the documentary that we made, ADD and Loving It, ? Like what? For the people who have it and know how debilitating it can be, that's like, what? How dare you? And for people who think it's a joke, what an excuse, it's like Loving It. They were going to watch it and say, see, there's people who love their ADHD. Anyway, so I got both groups in, the skeptics and the people who knew better. That's and and it worked really well. People who had been dismissive were calling their kids up and saying, I'm sorry, we didn't know. Can you forgive us? So there was a lot of healing. There was a lot. And then there were eventually, once it was on PBS, there were millions of people who were getting diagnosed. And I told that the big ADHD conference that just ended in November in Anaheim, that they had a thing on influencers, and they asked who are the biggest influencers, and Alan Brown said it all started with Rick Green. And
wow, that's great.
Yeah. Oh, how cool is that? And in fact, I don't think I have it with me here. It's somewhere around, but I was appointed to the Chad Hall of Fame for all of that. Yeah. And I got the Order of Canada, which is a huge deal. I found out. Order of Ontario. I got a side order of New Brunswick, which comes with like there were all these awards and mental health awards and so on. So because people realized that more and more people have, as many people had it as ever had it, really, I think.
Yeah.
But
that movie was 2009, right? think it was
Yeah, because we
Yeah.
got the go ahead in 2008, and then we made it in 2009, and then the economy crashed, and then they said we won't be able to air it for probably 2 years, and then they gave us very short notice and said we're going to air it in 4 weeks or 3 weeks, and
Oh,
we
wow.
didn't have time to do publicity or anything. It was so perfectly so
Yeah.
ADHD, right? And but it went on the air on Global Television Network,
Yep.
and
My old employer.
Oh yeah, okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
I worked for Can West before moving south. Actually, I
Okay,
worked
there
for
you
Global
go.
Television. Yeah.
Yeah. So and the reaction was huge. They didn't know what to do with it. They were referring people to us because they never had a reaction to anything they'd ever done like that. People, how do I find these people? Where's Rick? Can I talk to him? And so on. And so yeah, that's my story. And it wasn't like I planned to do it. I mean, I was 8 or 9 years into my own diagnosis, or a life with knowing that what it was. But I thought we'll do this, and then I had a bunch of other really cool ideas to get to next, and none of that happened, because when you got people saying, they had bought pills to kill themselves, and then they happened to catch your program, and I flushed those pills down the toilet and saw my doctor Monday morning, demanding to see him, and I've been on some very different pills for 2 weeks, and everything's changed. It's like, oh my God, we're saving lives. And I'm not trained, Dave. I'm not trained to do this. So it was, but we dove in. We made some mistakes. And this can be a very sensitive group of people, hypersensitive. So I'm cautious, but yeah, humor lets you get away with a lot.
It does. And the thing is, when you're authentic and you're vulnerable and you're being, all the things, all the cliches you hear, transparent and whatever. But like I think that's how I approach this too. Right. Like, and I'll point out when I'm wrong. Like and I also, like you said, like I always say, I'm not a doctor, nor do I play with on the internet. So I'm not a doctor. So, I'm learning about this like everybody, or like we are at least. And yeah, like, for example, I learned that, like, just recently I talked about it on this show, that ADHD, there's only one type of ADHD. There's not 3 types. I always thought there was 3 types. It's 3 presentations of the one ADHD. So like, and it shows differently in different people and changes throughout your life as well. So it's all these like fascinating things you learn. And the thing is too, like in your, defense, I guess, of any errors or mistakes or whatever that were, or not, I wouldn't even say mistakes, but like in the movie, which is fantastic, by the way, I did watch it after we spoke, and I loved it. It's science. So like things will change. We want them to change. We want to learn new things about this. And even the bloody name change. It's like, oh, come on. Like, I'm sure for you, it's like ADD. What are we, ADHD now? Like, oh, that's a pain in the butt. I got to buy another domain.
Yeah, we bought them both. But I mean, before that, it was called minimal brain dysfunction.
Yes.
And a defect of moral control. And
hyperkinetic children or whatever.
Yeah, which is, and that's kind of accurate. It is kind of a minimal brain dysfunction for a lot of people. I mean, you and I are coping on some level. And for me, coping much better, knowing what's going on. But this is not new. The Dr. Alexander Crichton, I think it is, somebody can fact check this one, but Dr. Alexander Crichton in 1798, I'm good with numbers, was describing kids who basically, he was listing the symptoms of ADHD. And then throughout the 1800s, there were other doctors, German doctors had picked that up and were talking, what's the name of Fidgety Phil? It got translated.
Fidgety Phil,
yeah. That was apparently a doctor who wrote that. Fidgety Phil, can't sit still. And so that all of that goes back, and it goes back farther and farther. You can, what do they call them? Forensic diagnosis, where you can look at someone's life and go, oh yeah, okay. Yeah. And that's why they can list people like Winston Churchill or whoever. And that's it. He struggled with a lot of these symptoms, and did did well.
But that's the thing too. And you're a great example of someone who has had this great lasting impact, certainly on me as a comedy fan growing up
That's
on
nice.
the stuff that you did and on, like SCTV, of course. And I studied improv at Second City in Toronto because of all that. And I've always and performed a lot of improv. Like I've always been a comedy fan, and like I saw Kids in the Hall taped a couple times at CBC back in the day and loved Kids in the Hall. But even with the Frantics, you had this great way before even Kids in the Hall, Four on the Floor, which I'm sure inspired I'm sure inspired the Kids in the Hall, I would imagine.
Yeah. Well, I remember.
Yeah, sorry, talk a little bit about that. That was from the 1980s, right? Like Mr. Canoe Head.
Yeah. Well, Dave from the Kids in the Hall.
Dave Foley, yeah.
Yeah. Dave said at one of the awards ceremonies, was telling his story and then there was a show called Four on the Floor with the Frantics. And I saw that show and I thought, well, I'll never get on television unless the Frantics get canceled. And the Frantics got canceled. And it was all budgetary. And it was really nasty. We found out, not nasty, it was, we just found out later that the network wanted us to continue, but we weren't told. And anyway.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So we could have gone on and on and on. And that kind of killed what was a pretty cool thing.
Yeah.
Dr. Demento, who is kind of the legend in comedy and knows everything, his encyclopedia, he said when we visited him, when we were in California and we went on his show, and he said, I'm with the funniest comedy troupe in the world that doesn't have a snake in their name. And I thought, wow, because that's who I aspired to, was Python, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So that
I was going to say, my dad bought me this book when I was a kid about comedy, about Canadian comedy. And it made the case. I've tried to find it. I don't remember what it was called or anything, but the book makes the case that the reason why Canadians are so funny, and our humor is so good, is because we draw from like the British influence as Canadians, and of like sort of quote unquote taking the piss, and like being silly and all this stuff from like Monty Python, like Flying Circus and things. But then we also are heavily influenced, whether we want it or not. We're influenced by American media and American comedy, and there's plenty of great stuff there, of course. Mr. Show is my favorite. But with American comedy, it's more generalizing, but it's more like like the Canadians more self-deprecating and the Americans more observational on things. And so it's kind of a chocolate.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's kind of a chocolate and peanut butter sort of situation with Canadians and humor, because we have influences that are great, but when we put them together, delicious.
Yeah. And I think, we're probably, I don't know how big our population is compared to the British population, but I mean, we're almost like 1 in 90%. What is it? Whatever. What I'm trying to say is there's 340 or 50 million Americans, maybe it's more, and there's 40 million Canadians. So, we're the size, the entire country, which is bigger than the States and bigger than Australia. It's huge.
Yeah.
And we have a population about the size of California, without the economy of California. It's all raw materials, basically, shipping them out and then buying stuff back when it's built into a phone or whatever.
And then paying up the wazoo for it.
Yeah. And I think, there's a kind of self-deprecating and just kind of a slightly weird twist. And I would say it probably draws as well on some of the French culture, the French farce, with Quebec and so on. There's all these different elements.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a great point. So you started writing, and I'm tying it back to ADHD here because, I can certainly, we wise squirrels, as I like to say, are often heavily creative, very creative people. Whether we're able to make a career of it or capitalize on that creativity is another thing sometimes. But as far as sketch comedy and like writing back in the day, is that kind of where you cut your teeth, I guess, was then or before that? Like, tell me a little bit
I think
about
even
that.
before that, growing up, we had 8mm camera, and we would go out and make silent comedy. And in fact, a lot of the physical stuff that I ended up doing as Bill on the Red Green show, the character, was stuff my brother and I did up at the cottage. I'd go around and do stuff, and he filmed it with the camera. And we just try out. I mean, there was no story to it. It was just me trying to 6 different ways to fall down and not get hurt, or make it look like I'd fallen down and not get hurt. And then, you know, at university, I was on the campus radio station doing comedy, and when I should have been studying. And and then eventually there was cable TV, where, you know, community access, Channel 10, where anybody could get on the air. And so we did a show there. I got a bunch of friends together, and we did a series. It wasn't even a series, it was like 4 episodes, called Change Channels. And I did most of the writing, and my friends worked on the props and so on. And then Paul Chadwell and I, high school mate, started out together, and then became the Frantics, and so on. It just evolved over the decades.
Thank God for cable access, because, you know, without that, because I'm also a big Tom Green fan, no relation for listeners. Apparently some of the best Canadian comedy has the name Green for some reason.
Red Green.
Red Green. Yeah. But even Tom Green, you know, starting on like Rogers cable access, and like I used to record his show, and I don't remember anybody before, other than like Alan Funt maybe, doing like man on the street pranks, but Tom Green was the first, I think, to do like man in the street pranks and weave it and also have like a talk show format as well. So and of course he went on to inspire many others like Eric Andre and others. So it's and like you guys with Kids in the Hall too. Like, I mean, I was such a diehard Kids in the Hall fan. So, but I think I wanted to tie it back to the ADHD and the creativity piece of it too, because I think, like, as far as like writing, I'm curious actually, like with sketches, right? Like sketches are short, they're small versus a full movie script or a book.
Right.
Reflecting on your career, do you see how like sketch writing might have been more of your jam? Or and correct me where I'm wrong here, like rather than writing like a full length feature film or whatever. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So I tried, you know, I wanted to be a screenwriter. I wanted to be Woody Allen or you know, who was the Billy, the apartment, Billy.
Wilder? No.
Well, Billy Wilder.
Was it Wilder? Yeah.
Billy Wilder. That's what I was. But to sit for 4 months or 6 months working on a screenplay, you know, and character arc and story arc and managing, it's like, or I could, and all my influences were really, I mean, I watched the Marx Brothers and there were comedy movies, but really it was television, Jonathan Winters and Carol Burnett and all of that, right? Short skit. And in Canada, there was Wayne and Schuster.
Yes.
I think they were the most frequent guest on the Ed Sullivan Show. They did more appearances than anyone else, but never left Toronto. So there was, the sketch comedy just suited me. You got, how quickly can you establish the situation? How quickly can you establish the characters, the time, the place? And when we went to, Frantics started on, like we started on stage, but when we went and got a national radio show, that was incredible training for the power of language, because you were really, all you had were the words and the sound effects to create Mr. Canoehead or Todd Booster Space Cadet, or all of these incredible goofy things that we did on the air. It was really training in, as I've said to when I'm conducting workshops on writing, I said, if you could say it in half the number of words, people will think you're twice as funny. And so it's that compressing, you know, of Miss Piggy saying, you know, pretentious, moi. It's like one word setup, one word punchline. There's your gag. So I think the sketch comedy really was, well, it was what I was meant to do. I couldn't tell you how many thousands of skits I've written, but it's over 700 episodes of radio and television. No, not on my own.
Yeah.
But almost always with other writers, because writing alone is just it's boring. Whereas when you're writing with three other people, as I was with the Frantics, or even just with Steve and I on the Red Green Show, you've got this. Oh, that's good. That's funny. Okay, what can I do? Or what does it spark in me? And the Frantics did something really brilliant that I don't think anyone else did. I've never heard anyone else doing this. It was, we read our scripts, and when you're finished, you put it in the center of the table. We stacked them all up, and then it went through. Okay, who wants the human race one? I'll take it. Oh, I got an idea for that. And then you held one up, and who wants the electric cheese one? And no. Now, the person who came up with the electric cheese could either go, you know what, it's not clear, and then maybe he gets some suggestions, but otherwise it was like, okay, we'll leave that for now. And you rarely, and then, so then stuff got rewritten by everybody eventually. And we had 3 or 4 minute scenes, sometimes shorter, that went through 12 drafts because you could just open it up and change a few lines and then continue on. And as we were going along, we switched from typewriters to these electric typewriters that could memorize a whole line and erase it. And eventually, of course, word processors and the Bosch and all of that came along. And we were, then we could trade the scripts without ever having to retype everything. God bless it.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I mean, with the whole sort of, the whole process or process, I said process, I've been in the States too long. That's how I'm like process. I sometimes forget, and then I'll start talking like metric to an American, and they'll be like, "Wait, what are you talking about?" Right. So it all gets very confusing. I say y'all, and then I'll say y'all or I'll say like all y'all and that gets really weird. But so that's I do think there's this like real connection between creatives, comedy certainly as well, but like the creatives and ADHD, whether it's diagnosed or not. I think even in sketch comedy or something, like I think you're creating these quick, to your point about like really, fast beats, fast laughs. I took a stand-up comedy course a couple of years ago and did 6 open mics in 6 weeks exploring stand-up because I'd always been a fan. I'd never done it. And this is before I was diagnosed. And I was like, let me go do it finally. And so I did it. And I've since have learned about like LPM, the metric laughs per minute. And the idea with a live audience is like you record your stand-up set or sketch or whatever. And then you watch it and you cringe and you count your laughs. And then basically you divide it by a minute. And then you're trying to like, ultimately you're trying to have like a solid 5, 10, 20 and so on. It's and well, you said you did improv, and that's I was the only one of the Frantics who didn't really dive into that. The others got into it, and who else is but somebody with ADHD is going to get up on stage without a script? And one of the reasons that you see a lot of those people with ADHD getting up on stage without a script is they have dyslexia. And so I've known a couple of actors who went from improv to appearing in a play, and it was hell. They'd forget their lines. The other actors would be furious, and they were used to everybody just kind of picking it up and playing with it and messing around. But when you've got cues and lighting and props and costumes and so on, then it's a big problem if somebody isn't delivering their lines. It's improv in some ways is another perfect field, and there are lots of perfect fields, I think, or not perfect, but good fields. One of the series of videos that I've been working on is called the best career of ADHD for ADHD. Okay, nice. Tell me some of those that you found. Like, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll just jump around a bit, but like, for example, for improv or for improv, perfect. For sports, intense laser focus, and then you see the baseball player laser focused with the bat or with the glove, and they're looking and they're staring. And then when they get to the dugout, they're on, they're off, they're on, to switch on, switch off. So athletics, Michael Phelps, ADHD up the wazoo, music business, entertainment business. who but somebody with ADHD and that energy need is going to get up on stage and perform and overcome their fears. All of the, I often say, if you dial 911, you'll get a bunch of people with ADHD showing up at your house. And I gave a talk to paramedic organization, and you could see a lot of pennies dropping in the audience. And the head of the organization who got me to speak there knew he had ADHD. I think he may have even gotten the diagnosis after seeing our documentary. And he said that the paramedics he knows who have ADHD, and he's gotten fairly adept at spotting them, as we all seem to be able to do after a while, or at least suspect. But he said the ones who have it are great, because whatever happens, they're just, whereas everyone else goes from normal state of mind to gunshots, and they're, and the ADHD people are like gunshots. And now we're here, right? And he said the ones who don't have ADHD, they end up quitting or becoming administration, teachers, supervisors, things like that, instructors. So there are certain fields, high energy fields. Now, if you don't necessarily have the hyperactivity, the restlessness, then there are still other fields that can work for you. And it's also depends on your interests. So, if you have a dramatic interest in doll houses, you might be able to make a living making really beautiful doll houses for a high-end market. What's that?
How did you know about my doll houses?
Exactly.
And I call them doll homes.
Okay, then. I mean, and I have a giant model railroad, and it's
nice. That's cool.
Yeah. And but here's what's interesting about that. When I mentioned that to Eric Tivers, who I don't know if he's still doing it. Yeah, I think he is ADHD Rewired. He said to me, afterwards, when I said, I think I have a bit of Asperger's going on, a little bit of high functioning autism. And he said, oh, I knew that the minute you said you had a model railroad. So that brings us to another issue, is that there's this huge overlap with anxiety, depression, OCD, Tourette. 70-something% of kids with Tourette syndrome also have ADHD. So there's that. I'm trying to think of some of the other jobs. Well, here's an example of a different disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. Guess what they do? Airline mechanic.
Oh, okay. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, please. Exactly. You fix it. Guy with ADHD, you go make funny in-flight entertainment. Check the rivets, check the doors, it's that finding that niche. We had a young man who was quite strongly autistic. He could carry on a conversation, but I'm told by a number of good friends who have a child or know a family member with autism that they have their thing. So for me, it was trains. And his thing was movie trivia. And I was thinking about it, and he didn't work out as an editor because that requires creative decisions. And, what was interesting is I once asked him, I mean, they can be creative, very creative, but he wasn't capable of making the jump. And I asked him, okay, why don't you just go through this and grab still frames of people smiling? So I want some happy frames because I need some happy images. Well, he couldn't figure out what smiling was.
Oh, wow.
But he could tell you the entire cast of the cowboy Hollywood serial from Rocket End Studios from 1936 to 39, starring a little known Biff so-and-so. And I thought, this man should be working for IMDb, the International Movie Database. Right? Yes. That's where he should be, because he's a walking database. So it is partly, I think, not just, I'm restless, so I should get into sales, good idea. But also I love connecting with people. I'm easily overwhelmed, but I'm interested in medicine. Well, you could become a medical researcher. So you're not dealing with patients. You're not dealing with emergencies, you're doing research into molecular structure, whatever.
Yeah.
So there's a, the phrase that you keep hearing is follow your passions. It's like, yeah, if I followed my passions, I'd be a professional television watcher and model railroader, but that's not going to do it. But I do think you got to figure out what you do well, what you enjoy doing, even though, writing comedy is stressful, because even now writing videos, it's like, I don't know how this is going to turn out starting. Yeah. So it's figuring out what you do well, and then figuring out a way to market it, or to see if anyone's willing to pay for it.
Yeah, I'm a big, oh, sorry, go on.
No, and if nobody is, maybe that's your hobby. There are people who work on car assembly line, and their mind is free to come up with all kinds of ideas, and then they're coming up with music ideas, or their passion is in their spare time, whatever, a sport or music or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because actually I was just talking to a friend earlier about, because I've worked in like a lot of technology startups and things like that in that world. I was a speaker for Google for about 6 years, and we used to do this thing for a business accelerator that I worked with. We called it co-founder speed dating, and the idea was to like bring together co-founders, bring together people who want to start businesses, who bring different talents. And ultimately the goal there, in a lot of scenarios, would be like, you've got your like technologists who's generalizing, of course, who's more introverted, more creative, and so on. But then you also, and who gets hyper focused, maybe if they're an ADHD, or in coding, which is also, common. And then you also get connected with like an MBA extrovert neurotypical type who's also great at what they do, but like by bringing them together, you've got like a dynamic duo who can then put together a viable business. And I feel like even for me, for Wise Squirrels, this passion project really that started for me became a bit of a mission as I started hearing from and reading reviews and getting emails, like you mentioned. Like, I'm hearing from my listeners, and this is helping people, and it's helping me too, of course, because that's why I started it, to learn about ADHD, and being late diagnosed. But for me, it's like, oh, but I need a sponsor, because I need to make it. I need to start to shift to make it a business, because this is what I want to be doing. Like, this is it. Right. And I have a keynote presentation, and I'm working on my next book that is about this stuff. And I've been hired to do that talk a bunch of times. I just did it recently. Are you familiar with Ikigai, the Japanese?
I've heard the name.
I wrote a blog post about it a while back, but it's part of the route down this presentation that I do. And the idea is that there's like four circles that are kind of over each one. And once the top is what you love to do, like what you love. The one on the right is what the world needs. The one on the bottom is what you can be paid for. And then the one on the left is what you are good at. And these circles overlap. And so you've got what you love and what the world needs. That's your mission. And then what the world needs and what you can be paid for, that's your vocation. And what you can be paid for and what you are good at is your profession. And then what you love and what you are good at is your passion. And right. So by going through this exercise, and I've got a whole blog post on Wise Squirrels that breaks down the steps and everything. But when you go through this, ultimately what you're trying to do is extract your ikigai, which is like your purpose, like why you're on this earth, or what have you. Right. And I think it's a great exercise, among others, to go through to try to find what fits for you. Like for me, I love speaking. I love being on stages. I love delivering presentations and getting the audience laughing and so forth. And I love it. Now, reflecting on my own career as a speaker, I've learned that it's the dopamine. it's the rush of dopamine I get from the audience that I didn't realize I was craving and that I need. And it's part of the reason why I wrote a book about networking. Like I love organizing events and bringing people together and connecting people. And again, it's that I'm extroverted, obviously, if that's not painfully obvious already. It is to my wife.
Yeah. No, I picked that up. Yeah.
Who's introverted. She gets home. She's a school teacher. She's the one who's been telling me for years I have ADHD. And it's like, oh, I should have listened.
Yeah.
And she gets home from work and like, she doesn't want to talk to me. She wants downtime because she's a school librarian. And I get it. And she's introverted. And my kids get home and they're like door. They're teenagers. They don't want to talk to me anymore. So I'm like, it's just me and the dog again. It's rather sad, but yeah. What other projects or things that you're working on right now that people can check out? And I love the videos you're doing. They're both informative but also hilarious. So you do such a great job there. Tell me about that.
Well, so what I've been working on, so for 3 years, we weren't really talking about ADHD, and there's a long story as to why. And now we are starting in, I guess, beginning of July, we're back in the game again. So that's pleasing. But of course, the videos, I don't know, there's probably 200 of them, something like that. And those videos are dated. And some of them are now 13 years old or more. And there's a lot more knowledge now. I can also see things like I say, now I'm ADD. It's like, no, that's politically incorrect. You say, I have ADHD. You don't say I'm cancer. And it's like, okay. Although part of me goes, no, I am ADHD. It's core. But
this is a great point, by the way, because this is something I've talked about with guests and I'm still undecided on is